Just tell everybody a little bit about Therese before we start. Therese sent me her CV, which was so spectacular and marvelous. So Therese, I did abstract it a little bit, please. I ask for your indulgence. But for those of you that don't know Therese Schollard or know of her, Therese is the owner of My Surgery Plate LLC. And until she retired last year, or as I like to say, transitioned, because I bet you she feels like she's busier than she ever was, she was the clinical nutrition manager of a large healthcare system in the Pacific Northwest. Therese received her undergraduate degree from Eastern Washington University, completed her dietetic internship at St. Mary's Hospital and the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, which is where Therese and I first met. And later she received an MBA from City University of Seattle. Just one of Therese's many focus areas has been adult disease-related malnutrition and sarcopenia, including NFPE. Therese has been an absolute pioneer in the application of hand grip strength as an objective measure in the diagnosis of malnutrition. And in fact, in 2017, she published the toolkit on hand grip strength assessment that so many of us use as a reference. Therese served on the Aspen Academy Malnutrition Work Group that led to the Adult Malnutrition Consensus Statement. She's currently a member of the Aspen Malnutrition Committee. She has a post with the Commission on Dietetic Registration. And last, but certainly not least, in Therese's illustrious career, she is the well-deserved recipient of the Academy's 2020 Management Excellence in Practice Awards. So Therese, welcome. We're really excited to hear the questions from the participants, and we're really excited to hear what you have to share. I know that, Michelle has asked people, please put your questions in the chat. Let us know that you have a question if you'd like to call it out live. But I'd like to kick off our conversation today, if I may, Therese, by asking you, you really have been a pioneer with hand grip strength. How did you initially become so involved in the use of hand dynamometers for the measurement of hand grip strength?
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I surely appreciate everybody's interest. I think it's so much fun and so interesting to deal with grip strength, and I'm so happy to see so many other people think it's interesting too. And, like many of you, when you're reading about malnutrition and such, grip strength will come up, and it's usually in a lower paragraph in one sentence, and it'll say also something about grip strength. So I had seen it for years and years and years. And then when I was honored to be one of the members, along with Louise, on the work that was done for the 2012 consensus, we had a medical advisor that many of you probably know, Dr. Gordon Jensen. And I remember on one of the calls, he said, you guys, you need to look at functional measures. And maybe you remember this too, Louise, and look at functional measures. And he said, grip strength, there's a lot of literature on grip strength. And so we looked at it and had agreed, all of us agreed, I believe it was consensus, that should be one of the markers. And at that time, really, there was so much work to be done with that whole concept that it was on the list, but it wasn't the first target. And how I remember it, one of the last meetings we had in our group, it was toward the end of the meeting, and I asked Dr. Jane White, who was the chair of the group, if, I could work on grip strength a little bit, because I thought that was really interesting. And at the time, I thought, I'll go copy something, it'd be half a sheet of paper, and I'll take care of it. And so after a while, I just started pulling literature and looking at it and reading about it. And I just found it so interesting because it tied in malnutrition, it tied in sarcopenia, it ties in frailty, and it's throughout a lot of literature. And I'm like, when people can't grip and can't move, their muscles are not strong enough, they can't prepare food, they can't go to the store, they can't clean their kitchen up, and the muscles respond to nutrition faster than the mass. responds to the nutrition. And so those were just very intriguing. And so I really didn't know what I was doing. So I just worked on it and for about 5 years and read and tried to figure it out. And one of the things I did was I worked for this large health system who had a wonderful board certified occupational therapist named Amy Rinder. And Amy, I called up rehab and I said, I need to talk to somebody about grip strength. And I said, you go talk to Amy. So I went and talked to Amy, and Amy was fabulous. And she was so understanding about, I explained to her what we were doing, and she knew about it. She knew about malnutrition and grip strength and sarcopenia and all that. And so she coached me, and we had 5 dietitians, and we became super trainers. And she gave us she went through and trained us on the methodology and gave me some pointers on where to go look in the literature. And so we had 5 super trainers in our organization in Oregon. And so we set about trying to coach and teach staff. And I knew as a clinical manager, I was going to need some training materials. So ultimately what happened was I created this document called Welcome to the Grip Strength Toolkit. And I also published, courtesy of the Dietitians in Nutrition Support, an article about it in 2017 called Handgrip Strength Assessment, a Skill to Enhance Diagnosis of Disease-Related Malnutrition. So, that's what it just evolved over time. And then I'm such an avid promoter of DPGs. I thought, well, I'm going to own this, and I'm going to share it with my DPGs.
Therese, can I interrupt you for just a minute? We have a lot of feedback coming through, and it's kind of hard to hear, Therese. So if everybody could just take 1 minute and make sure you're muted. I do have everybody muted, but some people I'm not able to because of the way you logged in. So if you could just make sure you're muted for the moment, and we'd love to hear from you if you have a question, but there's a bunch of papers and noise in the background. And so I want everybody to be able to hear. 76 people on. So if you could just take a minute, mute yourselves, that would be really, really helpful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Oh, that's much better. Thank you, everybody, for muting yourself. Anyways, I don't know if people heard that, but there is a publication, if you're a member of Dietitians in Nutrition Support, the article that describes the methodology for grip strength is in that. And then I was a member of quite a number of other DPGs because I just like them all. And they had reprints in there. And then when I made the grip strength toolkit, I gave them that to use. Now, there's no more CPE on this, I will say, because it's been 3 years, but the information is still very current except for the sarcopenia information, because for sarcopenia, this was from 2014, I think there were statements. The international groups that deal with sarcopenia have updated the sarcopenia information, the cut points and things like that. So, but other than that, as far as methodology, it's all there. And it's so much fun, and it's really interesting. And we trained our staff, and I think one of the questions that's probably on your list, Louise, is that people wonder about doing it in this location or that location. And a few years ago, I got this wonderful email from a dietitian in British Columbia, and I was so thrilled. It brought me to tears. I was so excited. And I'd never met these people. And they had used the toolkit, because I designed the toolkit so that you could do peer training with it, that you could train yourselves in a small group. She had facilitated that with a long-term care organization in British Columbia. And she wrote me they were doing it, and it worked great. And I thought long-term care is a really good place for this, because you can see people monthly, do interventions, and see, if anything's changing. I mean, yeah. So there, but different settings. I was trying to have an eating disorder program, because you could do pre and post and get some actually objective measures for things
So,
like
Therese,
that.
one of the questions that had come through, when we put out there a call for questions, was from an acute care facility, and their comment was they've had a malnutrition program. It seems to be working very well. They have not implemented hand grip strength, seem to see some challenges and some barriers. Is it really necessary? Is there a reason why they should layer this onto their program that's already been in existence for several years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think acute care is one of the trickier locations to implement it. I've heard from places that had it as a standard; they just do it as part of their nutrition assessment on every patient, and they seemed satisfied with it. And I've heard from places that just do it on certain patients. And so I don't know that there's much literature on people applying it and the pros and cons and what they discovered for us to make any big conclusions. But I think that it's something that people should think about. So where I worked, we weren't doing it on everybody. And there was occasions where the dietitians in there were so good clinically that they just knew, I need to do this on this case. And they did it, and it was useful. I mean, this is not a magic bullet that is going to tell you if your patient's malnourished or not. It's not. It's just another piece of clinical information to add to your comprehensive nutrition assessment. And it rounds out the picture, and it gives you a baseline so that if the patient declines or improves, you should be able to see some measurement if you did the methodology correctly and the repeat methodology correctly.
And I think one of the comments that you like to remind me of is this is an objective measure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting, the idea of objective measures. Most of what we do in medicine and in dietetics isn't perfectly objective. And like a weight, think about a weight. Now, how accurate and objective is that weight all the time? Or your calorie intake when you're estimating, or your your energy requirement when you're calculating. We call those objective measures, but they're not all that objective. And the dynamometer, given if it's calibrated, it's done by a trained person, and you do the right methodology, it's an objective number. And I think there's value in that. I don't think that it's going to, I think it's more of a supplementary criteria than a primary criteria for most cases. The only time I could think of where it could function as a primary criteria was if you had a patient you had no medical record, you had no ability to communicate, they could not understand or speak the language that you spoke in, and you just had zero information. You could actually do this and see, but that would be so extremely rare. So I think it's more of a good supplementary piece of information, and a baseline, and then for repeating is important on this. If you can, and if you have a health system that you can have a patient in different stages in the health system, so like they're in an ambulatory program, and then they're in a acute program, and then they go back to another ambulatory program, or it's being done for a senior over a period of time, I think that will be good. This grip strength started in 1954, and a lot of the years it's been in research settings. And I just feel like it's time to get it into clinical practice now for more, practical use. So I didn't really invent any of this. All I did was kind of organize it to help dietetics think about it and acquire it, and think about your settings and where you could apply it and supplement your nutrition program, your malnutrition program.
Michelle, I see some questions coming up on the chat. Do we want to?
Yeah. Yep, I'm ready for you. I was replying to one, but let me go ahead, Teresa. I'll read them so you can just answer. So Elaine had a question. When training staff members to use the hand dynamometer, how long does it take to train the staff members to be fully competent? And do you have any important tips related to that?
Yes. Well, I have taught different groups and large groups of people this, and it's really fun. And I tell you, if you can do it 3 times, right, you do it your first time, which you're really awkward. The second time, you're kind of getting it okay. And the third time, you kind of got it. I mean, it seems like it's about 3 complete times. And when I say a time, I say introducing yourself to the patient, explaining to the patient, performing the exam, writing the results of the exam, and in the practice, analyzing the results of the exam, and doing that about 3 times. And it's so much fun in a group. If you can team people up, and what I recommend in the toolkit is you team people up with 3. There's the person pretending to be the patient, the person who's the clinician, and then the person who I call a spotter. And in the toolkit, there's a checklist for what the spotter is supposed to do. And the spotter is supposed to correct everybody on how they move and how they do the test. And about 3 times. Now, that is accompanied by usually a lecture and education, which in a public in a meeting session, but you could do the same thing with reading the toolkit and reading the article. And I have a quick start guide in there, and I have practice forms in there. And I really, really thought about how can this get spread, and how it can get spread is by groups of dietitians thinking, this year we're going to put this on our goal and we're going to learn it. And then next year we're going to try it out in one of our clinics, that kind of thing, so that people could do that. Has that answered, do you think?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And then another question from Cynthia Brooke is, and I replied to this in the chat as well, because when we do our on-site training, we speak to sanitizing and cleaning of the dynamometer, but there's a 2-part question. So the first part, our dynamometer or recommended cleaning for dynamometers. I'll tell you, DM&A, we recommend going to infection control and finding out, what is the policy at the hospital for cleaning that device between patients, and speak to that. But any other thoughts on the cleaning, and keeping infection control between and using the tool?
Yeah, and I did the same thing when I was working, and they told me just use alcohol wipe. So what we did with the kit, so the kit, I have one here, I don't know if I can show it, but they come in a plastic carton with a foam insert, and the dynamometer's in there. And what we did is I put alcohol wipes in there. We put the charts on. I'll tell you about some charts later. We put the charts in there. We put, what else did we have? Anyway, I made the kit in the big case have all those things. And so a lot of places might do a policy on keeping it clean. There's one thing I left out of the toolkit, and guess how I learned this? If you're not going to use it for a while, take the batteries out. It's a digital one, because they corrode, and that's an expensive corrosion. So.
And that,
so cleaning, you just clean them before and after. And I like to clean in front of the patient, so they can see that it's clean. So, but it's got a lot of parts on it, that are, you just do it.
And I think too, I'm glad you pointed out about the batteries, because if a person does have a dynamometer that has batteries, or if they get it from PT or OT, to check those batteries, and to really inspect it and have biomed do their calibration. And that was Cynthia's part 2 of her question. They said our dynamometer recommends sending it in annually for recalibration. Are others doing this? How do you do it?
Oh my gosh, that rule, because the instructions to the dynamometer say that, and that, sent terror through me, because I had bought, at that point, I had 13 in the state, and I'm like, I will never see them again. So I called up the wonderful people that work in biomedical engineering, and I asked them about this. And because when you order your dynamometer, if you work for an organization, it has to get passed through biomedical engineering, and they have to put a sticker on it and code it and everything. And what those guys told me, and I would encourage you to go ask your own people, they said, look, this is a really stable instrument. This particular brand is a very stable instrument. And he said, you probably don't need to get it calibrated every year. And actually the ones, I had 3 that were several years old, and they were right on. And then, so I think you work for an organization every year to go have a conversation with your bioengineering fellows. Now, if you're like me now, I don't work for an organization. So I've been trying to figure that out. And there are companies that do calibrate equipment locally, probably if you live in a larger area of town. But you can ship it back to the company, and in the instructions, it will tell you how to do that. I was just terrified because I thought we'll never see him again. But that's a good question. And I have a funny story about that too. I was some years ago, I was training our occupational therapists about why the dietitians are doing this for nutrition, and that it was, what we were up to. And afterwards, one of the OTs was really upset because she had been doing the dynamometer on herself and was very weak, and she couldn't figure out. She was really upset. And I said, well, try mine. And so I had her use mine. And then the OTs were all saying, you know what, we haven't had this calibrated for a really long time. And so that was kind of funny, but you do need to get them calibrated. I don't know that it has to be every year. And I think what that would be depends on how often you're using it. So if you're using it, every day for 10 people, I think you probably should. If you're using it, once a week, 5 people, maybe it's not so much, but it is important. And that's why there is a gold standard dynamometer. And I don't have any arrangements or relationships with any dynamometer company, but the American Society of Hand Therapists basically publishes and owns the methodology. They've done a huge amount of research. There's a book on it, 3rd edition. You go to asht.org, you can see it. And it describes everything that I'm telling you, as well as what I wrote, plus more literature in the background. But anyway, they recommend the JMAR brand. And there's 2. There's a digital one and a hydraulic one. It's got a dial on it. And they recommend those. And the reason they do is because the people that do equipment, they test reliability of the equipment, and they test inter-rater reliability using the equipment. And there's just massive data and statistics on all this. And so the gold standard one is the JMAR, which this is the digital one, and this is the dial, the hydraulic one. And what they do then, so let's say you have a different brand, or you're looking at a different brand because of some reason, go into the literature and see how that brand compares with the JMAR, because there's some that aren't like 97% of the standard. There's some that are down in the 80s though. And also think about your utilization, because if you're like this long-term care facility, they were a high user of that. So you need that machine to be a really solid piece of equipment so that it doesn't disintegrate or fall apart or not work well. So you need, there's a lot to think about with it. And I mean, once I found out this was the gold standard, and the OT that was helping coach us said, just do this one, I really quit looking at the other ones because of that. Because, if anybody's done any research, how critical methodology is, how critical test, equipment is for all of that. So.
Thank you,
that answer that one? Yeah.
That's a great question. And the follow-up to that question, have you noticed differences between the digital and manual JMAR?
I have not actually used them on a patient, both, but that is really important. And one of the things, like this one, this is the dial one. I don't know if you could see that, but the inside circle is pounds and the outside is kilograms. And there's little teeny numbers there, and they're 5 pounds or kilograms apart. So when you're doing your examination, this is not my favorite one, because I'm having to sit there, okay, 5, 10, 15. and you're just eyeballing, is it a 2 or is it a 3? And whereas the digital one, it gives you a readout point, a decimal point readout, and it stops both of them when you squeeze them. Both of them stop at the peak, and then this one just gives you the readout, and then this one you have to read out, and there's a pin. There's a pin when this one works, and it works. I have friends, my friend Julie McGuire, who is just great on grip strength too. She really likes this one better. And and it is simpler to run, that's for sure. When you squeeze it, there's the dial goes up to the highest level, and there's a pin that gets pushed up to the highest level. So when you release it, the pin stays where the highest level was. And that's what you read. So you get down here, make sure you read the pounds or the kilograms, whatever you're in. So I like the digital one because of that, but they're both perfectly fine. And, one thing to think about, the dynamometers are really popular with athletes in sports. Well, our malnourished patients and frail patients are not anywhere near the pounds force on the squeeze that an athlete would be. So to me, having that little more precision from the digital, I prefer that. That's my personal preference, and there's absolutely nothing wrong. It is usually they're about $100 more for the digital one, and you have to mess with the batteries. So pros and cons.
Thank you.
Therese,
Excellent.
can I just mention, there was a question that kind of rolled up, and it was about how to access the toolkit. And I know you mentioned it was available through dietitians and nutrition support. Is it only for people in that DPG, or can others access?
No, and one thing that I'll remind people, this is not, you cannot get CPE on it anymore, and the sarcopenia stuff has been updated by the national organizations, but the methodology and the background is still valid. The dietitians and nutrition support, if you're a member, you just have it automatically as a member benefit. They do have an external store for dietitians and nutrition support, and I believe it can be purchased through their store if you're not a member. But I also, like I said, I really love the DPGs, and so I've also kind of loaned it to the oncology DPG, medical nutrition therapy, renal, healthy aging, dietitians in healthcare communities, I think peds, in-depth. Am I missing anybody? Anyway, and they have them in different locations on the DPG website. So you can go ask. I mean, and I have on occasion separately sold some of this as well. But I really wanted people to think about it and study it, and I thought having the DPGs be a vehicle to have it for their members was a good method, a good approach.
The next question we have is from John. Can you use the hand grip strength in a dialysis setting? If so, would normal ranges be different?
There is good literature on using it in dialysis. They don't, as far as I know, don't use it on the side, the arm with the graft, but you can use grips. For some reason, the patient's only one arm works. You can do the same method on the arm that is appropriate. And I would encourage people to, for their specialties, not just dialysis, is do a lit search on grip strength and dialysis. There are groups that do different ranges, but often they're smaller populations, like they'll do 50 patients or 30 patients. So there's no like national standard that for dialysis patients, this is it. But there is literature on it for all kinds. There's literature for liver, kidney, heart. I mean, they use it for a lot. It's a proxy for many things, outcomes, different outcomes and things. So it's not like it's only for malnutrition. And the malnutrition part, there is literature. People have just figured out, well, I'm defining malnutrition this way. And so of this population that I define malnutrition this way, this is what it showed up with the grip strength. So but it's still way wide open on things. So like if you even had a special population like eating disorders, there's literature on eating disorders with grip strength. And the thing that was exciting about that I remember was shown in one of the articles was the grip strength improves from nutrition therapy before the mass and before the recovery from the eating disorder. So the body, if you think about muscle and fuel utilization and muscle metabolism, the grip strength shows response before you can see mass or muscle quality. And so that's very, very interesting, I think. But I would explore it for whatever specialty you have. Get your librarian to do a lit search on it and see what's out there. You also, when you do that, you have to check on the methodology they use, because the ASHT methodology is what I think needs to be done, and it's standardized. But there are other groups that do little different things with the grip strength in the method, or how many grips they take, and so you need to know that for your specialty area, because it would matter, as you're thinking about all this. I mean, just take heart failure and look at all that literature with grip strength. You'll find a broad variety of standards. A lot of people do the JMAR, and a lot of them use the ASHT, but not all of them do. And so then the tables, the normalization tables that come with your instrument, most of those, or like the JMAR instrument, there's an author named Mathiowicz. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it right, but he did huge, lots of data, so much statistics on this. And so you want to know what your normalization table is, what one you're using, and in your literature, maybe all your literature on that particular disease uses certain kind of a normal table that's different from another group. So there's a lot to learn. That's why it wasn't just a half-page sheet. I kept getting buried. And there's some people around the world that have done just massive, amazing research on this, and I just have so much respect for them. They're just pretty amazing. So I think we need to bring some of this into clinical practice now. It's time.
Absolutely, and I believe that kind of answered probably the question regarding transplant patients and what is the role of hand grip strength measurement in transplant liver and kidney.
I have seen literature on transplant. Yep, and actually a transplant clinic is a really great place. So like for heart transplant or liver, because your patient's pretty malnourished usually at the beginning, and then whatever times during the process you can measure, and just think about what this would mean to the patient, and we haven't talked about that much. But how we're always telling patients, we want you to eat this nutrition and eat protein and do this. It'll make you strong. It'll help you heal, all that. One thing that I noticed with this, and I think it'd be really ripe for some research, when I was using this, and when you have a tool for some reason and you're saying that message about nutrition and healing and recovery, and you have a measurement tool, I saw lights go on in patients' eyes. They got it. They figured it out. And this happened more than once to me, just me. And I thought, you know what, we're missing something here. I think we can use this as a teaching tool and a communication tool and a patient engagement tool for why nutrition matters in your condition. And think about that. You have your heart transplant or your kidney transplant patient, and they're just miserable. And you've done this, and they're whatever they are. And then, 6 months later, after the transplant, after they've, are recovering, and they can see, you say, look what you did. Look what you did. I mean, just think about how fantastic that would feel and encouraging that would be to these people that have such, rough goes. And I think it would be really fun to do some research on that, to find out that more kind of approach to it and see if messages are learned and action behavior change from a nutrition standpoint is done. I've not seen anything like that in the literature. Maybe it's out there, but I've not seen it.
And your point to using it really to interact with the patient and as an education tool, if I may share, I remember coaching dietitians on site with the hand grip strength, and we were in a patient's room who we had seen the night before, in the cancer center. And that morning she got admitted to the hospital. So now she's in the inpatient setting, and we weren't able to work with her because she was receiving cancer treatment and she was wrapped up and really cold. And, we just didn't want to bother her. And, at that time and kind of she wasn't ready for a nutrition assessment with the dynamometer. But we were able to do it in the hospital. And I remember her spirits were so down. Like her weight wasn't coming up. She was trying. But when we did that hand dynamometer, wouldn't you know, she was in a normal range, and it just lifted her spirits, and she was so excited. And I just thought, what you're talking about, I'm like, wow, this is so awesome, because this lady was very sad when we came in, and now she has a little more hope. She has
there's some connection with that. I have a fun story. One of the dietitians had a patient's family member who was the patient was an older lady. She'd been in critical care, and then she was transferred to the floor, and she was doing better. And the dietitian said she's doing better. She'd told the family member that your mom's doing better, and but the family member was just relentless in worry about, is my mom malnourished? And the dietitian was so smart, and she said, you know what, we have this tool and I can do this. And so she and I went up, and there was quite a saga, but eventually we did the measurement, and her mom was kind of low, but it was exactly the judgment of the dietitian that your mom's doing better. And and it resolved the whole question. It just calmed everything down. So there's a lot more to this, I think. And you can learn so much about people. One of the areas that, when we get to go back in person, there's senior health fairs. And I had the best experience at those with this because, there's always a lot of tables, and all these people are promoting senior services and stuff. And the dietitian, we have our food models and our handouts, but I had this. And it was so funny because I could tell everybody in the group was like, what's that? What has she got that's pretty cool? And it was so funny. And people would come through, and you'd talk to them, and they'd, I'd say, well, would you like to have me check you? And they would, oh yeah, they were very engaged, and it got them to my table. And then I would do it, and then we'd have a discussion about it. And it's so fascinating. I had one patient who was one person that walked through that was just perfectly dressed, makeup, hair. I mean, she said, I exercised, an hour a day. And I'm like, wow. And she was a senior, and I was really impressed. And so I do this, and she's like below -2 standard deviations from the mean. She's like right down there. I'm like, what? You're exercising this? And I thought something wrong with my dynamometer. Well, I got to talking to her. She had bariatric surgery a year before and had lost 126 pounds and was taking no supplements whatsoever. And I'm like, wow. And then the next lady that came through had a crutch, and she was a shorter woman. She was a stocky woman, and she came through and she had a crutch. And you're thinking, oh man, she's not going to have any strength at all. This woman was off the chart. And I looked at her and I said, you work in your garden, don't you? And she said, every day. So I think there's a lot of, softer areas that can be used too that are really good for the dietitian. And we do need to think beyond malnutrition. I think we need to think sarcopenia, and we need to think frailty. And there's actually cut points for that now. And when you're doing an assessment and you're doing the proper methodology, and you're thinking about sarcopenia and thinking about frailty and thinking about malnutrition, and you get some data, that's good information for you to use your judgment and decide, is my patient malnourished? Are they not? What's going on? And then, a month later or 2 weeks later, whatever, do it again. And in the hospital, we had kind of arbitrarily set a week later, and just see what you think, because you will learn so much. And just, that was just what I learned, one dietitian, and I wasn't even practicing, as a manager. So I just think it's a really, really useful, but we have to get the methodology right. You have to get good equipment. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be familiar with the literature for your population, and and study it. And I think dietitians can teach each other, how to do this with that toolkit, and it walks it through. And I really want to encourage people to explore it, because I think you'll find it very exciting. And the other funny thing that goes on So, you know, you're walking in the hospital, there's a dietitian, we have all our papers or books. I can tell you, if a dietitian brings a piece of equipment anywhere, everybody else, the nurses and everybody's like, what's going on here? And it's like, oh, the dietitian's actually doing something. And it's a really good opportunity to teach your professional college. As you know, malnutrition causes muscle problems and strength problems. And we've got, this person needs strength. And this is the way we measure it. And we incorporate it into the diet and into nutrition education with them and that kind of thing. There's just a lot of potential there. One thing that comes up a lot, Louise, and I don't know if it was on your list, but people say, well, can't we use the OT or the PT measurement?
We did
and
have that as a question.
Did they have, yeah, because that comes up. And I'd like to comment on that, because if you're an OT, there's often a surgery or something went wrong with the hand. And the OT will measure the pre-surgery and measure through the treatment, because they give therapy, they tell exercises and all that, and they measure through all that. Well, that point in time is not a good measure for malnutrition, because it's reflective of the surgery or whatever went on. So what our OT said is at about 8 to 10 weeks after a surgery, then it will probably be okay for the patient to have for what we're doing for it. And so it depends on what's going on with your patient. And they're really different populations often, because if you had a patient that you thought was malnourished and just had broken their hand or something, you can't, it's not appropriate. It won't tell you a thing with malnutrition or anything, and it won't. So I hope that answers that question, because it does come up. In physical therapy, also it kind of depends on what they're using it for and why they're doing it. So you want to study that a little bit before you think that it's a nutrition related.
So Therese, with hand grip strength being showing us what the functional, a functional assessment of that patient is one of the 6 characteristics. I know you mentioned it's so important, have that correct equipment, have it calibrated correctly, and use it correctly to use it as a characteristic of malnutrition. What if, and so having looked at your toolkit and the training and so on, it's every other hand, and it's 3 tests and taking the average. What if, like you mentioned, a patient really only has one functional hand? Can that still be used as a valid characteristic of malnutrition?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, you use what you could get. Yeah, it's just fine. And in your documentation, you could explain that why you weren't using the other hand. So you would just explain it, that you did it only on the left hand because the patient had recent surgery on their right hand, and there are your 3 measurements. And this is because on the chart, the grip charts, this is one of them. It differentiates by hand and by age and by sex. And in fact, we were talking ahead of time about that, Louise. This is the chart, I probably can't see it, that comes with the dynamometer. And what the dynamometer has is only 1 standard deviation. And on this chart, it mixes the kilograms and the pounds up. And so it's really confusing. It took me a really long time to figure this chart out. And it's also broken down by age. So what I did for people, and I cross-checked it 14,000 times because I was so scared I'd do it wrong, is I converted in the toolkit, there's a female and a male pounds and a female and male kilograms. So I separated the sex, I separated the pounds and the kilograms. And then there's a chart of age, and then it's right hand or left hand, and then what the mean, because the normalization table will have the mean for that age, sex, and hand. And then I put 1 standard deviation, and then twice that is 2 standard deviations. So I wrote that number down. And then I renamed something called the alert level. So I did the math for people. So I subtracted 2 standard deviations from the mean, and that is the alert level, and that's printed on the form. So you don't have to do your own math. I think I'd encourage you to study it to make sure you understand how it happened. But I did do that for males and females, for pounds and kilograms. And just a refresher, and this is going to probably show it backwards. This is the bell curve. And for many, I know you guys know this, but for many nutrition parameters, -2 SD from the mean is where not normal is. And normal is between, -2 and +2. But everything below or beyond -2 is not normal. And that's one of the challenges people have too, is because you're not probably going to have that many patients that are at -2. You're going to have a lot of more people that are kind of close to -2. So what do you do about that? And what I decided was, since there's no literature, we don't know what moderate is. We don't know what moderate low grip strength is. But what I thought is just describe it in your note. Just say, look, this patient is getting really close to -2. It's still considered normal range, but she's getting really close. And then also your patient can become their own normal. So you really want to know what that patient is doing, with it, where they're going. So if they're trending down or trending up. So that would be just something you would incorporate in your note. In your note, you're going to have 2 things. You're going to have the actual numbers and facts and comparison of the numbers, and then you're going to have your judgment statement, and you're going to talk about what you think. And I actually, in the toolkit, there's some samples of that, and then you have to take that piece of information along with the other characteristics that you can get and decide what you think about this patient's nutrition status.
Therese, you had mentioned, some of the challenges, for instance, in acute care, hand grip strength. Are there populations where hand grip strength really just isn't appropriate and wouldn't be used?
Yes, and I talked with the wonderful OT about that quite a few times, because I had done a contraindication slide, and I wanted her to proof my slides, and she said, Trish, you can take a bunch of that off. And I'm like, what? Like I had arthritis on there and things like that. And evidently the patients can become their own norm. So if somebody isn't in pain, if you're in pain, don't do it. Stop it. Don't do it at all. So if somebody has pain on squeezing, don't do it. But she said, if an arthritic person is not having a flare and they're interested in doing it and want to do it, you can still do it. And then they become their own norm, because they won't fit on the normal table because they may be weaker. And then you can show the trend on that kind of person. So it depends on arthritis. The group that is probably not appropriate for nutrition factors is neuromuscular diseases, ALS and things like that. And yet they do grip strength on those populations to measure their overall situation, but that would not necessarily be for nutrition. We had an interesting case that I learned a lot from, and it was, we were practicing with some dietitians, and one of the people in the office space who wasn't a dietitian said they would be the patient. And so this person evidently had, I think it was either congenital or some injury to one arm. And so, and she was fine with doing it because she'd lived her whole life with it, and she was just always weaker in this one arm. And so we did the practice and stuff, and sure enough, she was weaker on that arm, but she was still within normal range. So how you'd interpret that was her right arm, or whatever arm it was just, you could use that normalization chart because she was fitted, but on the arm that was the weaker arm, she became her own norm on that arm from the nutrition perspective. So you would just describe that. So neuromuscular, if a patient has dementia and is not able to understand how to do the exam, then that would rule it out. But, it depends on the person's dementia. If they can follow instructions and you have reason that it might be a nutritional thing, you could still do it. But if there's pain, probably not things like ALS, although there are neuromuscular problems that patients are very stable on. And then you could do it and they could be their own norm. So it depends.
Patients in the ICU?
You know, I was like, no, we're not going to do it in ICU. And sure enough, I found literature in ICU. So I think if you're in ICU, yep, and I was surprised, but you know, really there is quite a range of people and their abilities in ICU. They'd have to be able to perform the test. You probably, I mean, the position of the patient should, if you look in there, they have to be sitting straight up, 90 degrees everywhere, and their arms have to be a certain space. But you can do it in bed too, and you just had to set the bed up, you know, to try to get a 90 degrees and keep their arms free. And so they can be positioned in bed, or if they're safe, for the side of the bed. So I think it would depend on that particular patient in ICU if you could safely do any of those positions, and that they would be able to do it. So I mean, there's more than malnutrition certainly that causes grip strength problems and influences the measures. And so if they were, you know, a very high stress response, but I did find literature on it, and they, you know, factored in a lot of that stuff. So if that's your unit assignment, I do lit search on it and see what you think, and you may decide it's not worth it, or it is. And then, you know, but maybe if it isn't a patient and you do it, and then, you know, 2 weeks later they're on the unit and they were improved, what a great education message about you're getting better, you know, too, even though that's not measuring malnutrition so much, but, or it might be, I guess, it depends.
Well, we're getting just about to the top of the hour. You know, we've been talking a lot about hand grip strength as a characteristic for identifying malnutrition. Therese, do you have any idea to what extent nationally that hand grip strength is used as a characteristic in identifying malnutrition?
I have no idea at all. All I know, just people, if they tell me they did it, I have no idea. This is such in infancy for our clinical practice. I think there's a lot of questions about it. And I mean, even, you know, what happens when, let's say you do this to patients and a third of your patients, they're toward the low end or even below -2. I mean, we don't know. We just don't know. And there's so many things, like if people don't do the methodology right, or have a, you know, a $20 dynamometer, you know, and then they decide that it doesn't work, or else their methodology isn't correct and they decide it doesn't work, you know, all those can influence perceptions. And that's why in the toolkit and when I speak about this, I really emphasize using the ASHT methodology and using, you know, these equipment that will do that. In the methodology, and you can see it in the article that was reprinted in these various newsletters for the DPGs and in the toolkit, there's specific language to use when you're instructing the patient. And I had some fun. There's a webinar that goes along with the toolkit, and I think I had kind of a funny story with that too, what I learned. But yeah, there's a lot to it.
We're seeing that somebody's having a hard time finding the toolkit on the DNS webpage. Is it still up there? Or?
It's in the, I saw it the other day. It's under the store. It's in the store on the DNS webpage. The different DPGs have it all over the place. And I'll go again, the ones that I can remember off the top of my head is oncology DPG is supposed to have it somewhere, DNS, CNM, medical nutrition therapy, dietitians and healthcare communities, renal. I think it's in in-depth somewhere. You have to kind of search around, and you might ask the administrator if you get stuck. But if you're a member of any of those, or if you're not, it's a good time of year to join and become a member. That's there.
This has been such a great conversation and lots of good information. And gosh, Therese, thank you for that information about patients in the ICU. So we're just about at 2 o'clock. Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you to close this out.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you, Therese, for just a wealth of information. This was a fun conversation to have, and this was our highest attended one. We had about 80 people on, which was just wonderful.
Great, thank you.
This is great. So we're calling you back for another topic. We're just happy to see you all join. We want to share with you, we'll follow up via email to see if you have any further questions. The DM&A Nutrition Division provides on-site support, education, and training to your dietitian team and interdisciplinary team in hospitals. We come in, our team comes in of dietitians and coaches, your team, side by side, working with the patient, specifically focused on malnutrition, the characteristics, NFPE, on-site training, and the hand grip strength. So if that's something you're interested in, please reach out to us. We've been doing this for now 11 years, and it's just exciting to see, there's, like Teresa said, we're in the infancy of the hand grip strength and using it beyond malnutrition. And so everything that we do, continues to just be fluid and grows. And the more research, I love that, Teresa, you mentioned that, because somebody in this group might want to start doing some research on that. I think that's wonderful. So beyond that, thank you. Keep an eye out. We'll have another clinical conversation here this summer. And if you do have any topics that you think would be interesting, shoot us an email. And you can reply to the email that was your invitation, or if you just want to email me or Louise, our first names at destination10.com. So Michelle at destination10.com or Louise at destination10.com. We'd be happy to answer that. And we'll throw our emails in the chat box too here. So thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.